Cool. Let's just launch right in. We do have some good questions for you. And the first one is if you just go back to your Coburn Creek aerial,
Sure.
and you're not going to be let off the hook so easily.
Which aerial do you want? Do you want this one
Uh,
or do you want that one? Doesn't matter.
I can't see any of them, so something may
Oh,
be locked up.
I hit pause. Sorry.
Yeah,
It's loading. Yeah.
something like that's perfect. So the questions, there were a couple of them related to this issue of, how do you stop the channel from moving into those yellow and red areas? What are the minimization techniques and mitigation things you can do? If we just worked in the green zones, knowing that streams don't always behave, how do we prevent them from doing things to those riskier areas?
Yeah, that's a great question. Um, First off, we need to just differentiate whether or not, what the degree of the risk is, and if the riverscape without any restoration is already posing a risk, maybe there's a low-tech way to mitigate that, or maybe that's an engineering problem. From a restoration standpoint, we're not looking at this from the perspective of trying to fix per se existing risks out there. What we're looking at is if we're going to potentially increase those risks with our actions, we better make sure we can mitigate that. Now, having said that, we have had some success. Actually, if we did the workshop up in the Asotin, we would have had Brad there for banter and to show us some cool examples where he's used some of these low tech. I mean, they're basically biorevetment, structures that you can use and put these things in on outside bends to prevent them from threatening infrastructure. And those can be a lot cheaper than traditional bank protection treatments. It's not what we're trying to teach here, but there are those things up your sleeve. But I think in this context, we're more concerned with evaluating whether or not we are going to be increasing risk. I would be very careful with promising too much because in terms of protecting infrastructure that's already being threatened, because that's taking on some liability that really is appropriately put to engineers who have a stamp and who are trained to deal with that.
Yeah, risk is inherent in every individual, right? So you need to have this conversation with the landowner, the land manager, that decision maker, so they are fully aware of the situation and can make their own decision about how much risk they're willing to tolerate.
That's right.
Like you say, you're not going to be able to potentially solve every issue, but I wanted to also ask, I guess, about the roads and culverts. We often hear about, boy, isn't that beaver going to plug that culvert? Isn't all that loose wood just going to float down and rack up? What are some of the techniques you've implemented to maybe minimize the potential impacts of making that risk worse?
Yeah, that's a great question. Density. More in the case of wood, clogging up culverts and bridges that are undersized. I mean, first off, we got to recognize that there's a lot of poorly designed infrastructure out there, or some of it's not even designed; it's just present. People can be very nostalgic about that, and it can be very important to them. But when you have something that like that is a fish passage barrier or is an undersized culvert, you've got a problem anyway, and so there should be a conversation about that. That being said, if you increase the density of wood structures, it depends on the size of the stream, but you can usually have enough Velcro, enough roughness that you're really not getting much in the way of export out of those things and into those areas. Plus, despite what designers or some engineers may tell their clients, anybody that owns property and has creek crossings, or anybody that works for a public works or a Department of Transportation, they don't believe what the engineers tell them anyway. They know damn well that they're out there every single flood paying attention, and there's just infrastructure that does require maintenance. So that's important to recognize. The beaver dam, beaver dams, there are deterrents that you can put out there. I would really strongly advise to not just preemptively put them out there, because you're just going to create a maintenance problem for yourself. Just identify that you're in a high risk area. Beaver dams could be right there, really close, and it's possible they could dam it up. And that's just something that needs to be discussed and be kept an eye on. And usually if these are important roads, that's happening anyway, whether or not people admit it.
Great, thank you. Yeah, I'm going to summarize a couple of interesting questions I've received, and I'll reserve my personal opinion until you're done. But it has to do with the vegetation, and you were describing a process of assessing condition, and would there be concern about flooding vegetation in the valley bottom and causing this compositional shift to wetland obligates that can't tolerate that kind of, essentially, should we be concerned about vegetation shifts one way or the other? Maybe you have species that depend on certain types of communities.
Yeah, I'll be curious to hear your response as well, but I would say, like all this stuff, that's a discussion. What are the management drivers? Some places, all eyes are on vegetation, and there's some threatened or critical community, and if that's what you're threatening, that's great. Now, if that critical community, not great, but it's something you should think about. If that critical community is only there because the stream is degraded, I take some issue with some of that. And I don't know. I don't really have a view that nature really casts judgments on winners or losers. It just is, right? It's just responding to these things. So yeah, these things are going to favor succession into different communities. Oh my gosh, you're going to kill a bunch of conifers or a bunch of sagebrush. Well, those shouldn't have been there anyway. They belong on upland surfaces. So
yeah, that's the conversation I was hoping you'd get at, because we're always joking in the workshops that, hey, Jeremy, aren't you the sagebrush ecosystem guy,
exactly.
the specialist on this, and you want to see sagebrush die? And the answer is yes, when it occurs in the valley bottom where it should never have been. It's only there because you dried it out. So one of the things that will be obvious when you start to do this is you should have that conversation with landowners about changes in vegetation, because people, like you say, if you've got a 50-year-old spruce tree growing out in the middle of your valley bottom, that thing's probably going to die when it gets its feet really wet year round. So, those are shifts in vegetation that you need to discuss and expect and anticipate. And on some of these systems are so low gradient that you lose all your woody plants altogether. It becomes a sedge meadow, and right. Those are things that you can probably predict based on the hydrology. And so my head always goes to fix the hydrology first, and then let the vegetation sort itself out. And we may enhance that along the way as we see maybe missing species or components that just aren't in the area because we pushed them out. But you got to get the water right first.
Yeah. It's so interesting how much money has been spent on riparian restoration without fundamentally addressing the hydrology and geomorphology problems first. And it explains really low success rates on riparian plantings, right? If you fix those hydrology and geomorphology problems, usually the processes follow. There's some wonderful work, actually, Kirsty Friars, who we mentioned before, just on dormant seed banks and plant material that's been dormant for hundreds of years, and then all of a sudden is reactivate these processes that we're talking about, and this stuff that hasn't been there forever comes back without any planting. Other places Nick mentioned earlier, when you fix the hydrology problem in Bridge Creek, they were planting 10,000 cottonwoods a year, and there's like 3 prior to some of this restoration. Now they're planting that amount, or were. Jeff Moss is doing this, and they're just taking off like wildfires. Wonderful. So invasives are a whole other story, and if you have an invasive problem, you have an invasive problem, and that's trickier, and that is more complicated. But Yeah, interesting stuff. We should probably switch gears. Is there anything else burning? Because I should probably hand over here to Nick.
I think the last thing I would say, Joe, on this is, there are other questions on that risk checklist that
Yep.
are more related to the type of landowners and their willingness and their ability to do adaptive management. And so for us, that risk checklist included their perspective and their risk tolerance.
Yeah,